Hello and welcome to the Russia Question. I'm Michael Ossorgin, director of the Russian program at Fordham University. This webinar is one of the many initiatives at Fordham's Orthodox Christian Studies Center, which facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world broadly understood. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit the website at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy. We encourage you to follow us on YouTube and share this and other videos with anyone who might benefit from them. Today, Serge Schmemann joins us to discuss his Echoes of a Native Land, 2 Centuries of a Russian Village. I have the old original version. Here, Schmemann's poignant memoir is a deeply moving meditation on his complex relationship with Russia across distance and time. This captivating work of nonfiction explores culture, faith, and the delicate threads of identity, a must-read for those seeking a connection to their roots. And I'll have a question for you about how you navigated reconnecting to your roots within the family. Born in Paris after his family fled the Soviet Union, Schmemann grew up steeped in Russian heritage. Through vivid vignettes of his years as a New York Times correspondent in the Soviet Union, familial legends, and ancestral voices, he pieces together fragments of a severed identity. Interwoven with the powerful stories of his grandparents, Schmemann contemplates the indelible imprint of the language and culture of a native land, in quotes, in which he was not raised. Visits back to an unfamiliar homeland after the Soviet collapse further complicate Schmemann's tenuous link to Russia. Ultimately, in elegant prose, goes without saying, she explores the poignant meaning of homeland for émigrés who carry ephemeral yet enduring echoes of their native land within. So today is special not only because we have the great fortune to speak with New York Times editorial board member and Pulitzer-Prize-winning reporter Serge Schmemann, but also because, full disclosure, we are both descendants of the book's central characters in the Ossorgin family. It is an absolute pleasure to meet and host you, Serge. I view today's conversation as a rather direct continuation of the fascinating, unending story that you tell so beautifully in your book. With that, I warmly welcome you and would like to give you the opportunity to open with a few words about your book.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. It's indeed a pleasure to be on, and with a genuine Ossorgin, who it's after all about your past and your family, that our joint family, we are related, that I wrote. The intent, however, was not so much to write a family history or a familial memoir, but to try to look at Russia and its fate and its history through the perspective of one village. This village was Sergeyevskaya, known by many other names throughout Russian history. When I came there, a muddy and destroyed little Soviet backwater. But the advantage I had was that our joint ancestors had written many memoirs, and that after they left in the Soviet history, it became populated by people who continued writing about it. There was an orphanage there, and many of the orphans wrote, and I got to meet many of the people who knew a lot about its past. So it had the advantage of really a past I could access, and also through local archives, but mainly the wonderful memoirs of Ossorgin allies. So it was a chance to really look at Russian history and Russian fate. And, in preparation for our meeting today, I went back over many passages and found that I wasn't that far off the mark, predicting where we might end up today.
I agree, for what it's worth.
Sadly, I will say.
Right. Well, I will come around to contemporary events, but first I would like to just focus on the book itself. Especially, it struck me that this kind of running theme through your book about what Sergeyevskaya is for everyone who stayed there, and this is the estate that proves to be the lens through which you view pre revolutionary and then Soviet and then post-Soviet Russia, through the family that inhabited this estate, right? And your grandfather, Sergei Ossorgin, he wrote about it as a spiritual and physical cradle for us. He writes, of course, when I say Sergeyevskaya, I presuppose that setting and that moral air which surrounded us when our parents taught us to talk, to pray, and to think. The air so suffused our upbringing that it is hard to say where the one ended and the other began. And he goes on to say that Sergeyevsky was almost like a being, like a person in their family, the way that they were so connected to this land and this estate, on which was built a church. And I suppose that made me think of another passage from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. And it's one in which the narrator is describing Alyosha Karamazov. He says, I have already mentioned that although Alyosha lost his mother in his 4th year, he remembered her afterwards all his life. Her face, her caresses, as if she were standing alive before me, he would think. Such memories can be remembered, everyone knows this, even from an earlier age, even from the age of 2, but they only emerge throughout one's life as specks of light, as it were, against the darkness, as a corner torn from a huge picture, which has all faded and disappeared, except for that little corner. So there's resonance here. You had mentioned Dostoevsky a couple of times in the book, but a couple of other authors, 19th century authors, who would either summer or spend long times at estates around Sergeyevskaya. And you do mention that the Ossorgins were real country people, real country folk who tended the land, and that was their focus was on the land and church. Primarily, and music prominently. But it made me wonder if you had a sense for what role Russian literature played in the Sergeyevskaya estate.
Well, there are sort of many questions in your question. And I think from one point of view, it is, of course, a very idealized, in my grandfather's telling, a very idealized childhood memory of a lost world, in which there are hardly any shadows. Everything is perfect. And he looks back already sitting in his armchair on Riverside Drive in New York, looking out over the George Washington Bridge, remembering this perfection that was lost. And I think that is the lament of many forced émigrés who leave a place. And especially Russians who throughout the history of the immigration had this toska po rodzynie, this kind of mournful longing for a lost world, which you do idealize in retrospect. But from a literary point of view, I think the village, the Dеревня, Russia's kind of vast, unending expanse of countryside, played a major role. I mean, Dostoevsky may be an exception because he was very much an urban writer, but all the other major 19th century writers, Pushkin had his Mikhailovskaya, Turgenev his Spasskaya Lutavinova, Tolstoy his Yasnaya Polyana, et cetera. And they would treat this as a source of either, in Tolstoy's case, some kind of deep spiritual truth. Turgenev saw it more as squalor. Gogol saw it as this kind of burlesque, a place, that famous scene in beginning of Мертвые души, Dead Souls, where two peasants just look at a wheel and discuss whether that wheel will break down before reaching Moscow. I mean, it's absurd, but in one form or another, the village, Dеревня can mean countryside or village, it's the same thing, played a major role. And I think in that sense, looking at it the other way, literature would have played a major role in the upbringing of any rural family. Now, most every kind of noble, well-to-do family had a country estate. The difference was between those who actually lived it and worked it and those for whom it was more a place to go back to in the summer. And in this sense, Ossorgins really were country dwellers, but they drew very near another major family, the Trubetskoys. Once Trubetskoy became vice governor of Kaluga, and so they would make fun of each other for being, either country or city folk. But I think literature, sort of culture, played an enormous role in the upbringing on an estate like that. They had two grand pianos. They played all the time. They put on plays in the provincial assembly, and they read every word and criticized it. But I think the more important point here is the role of the countryside in sort of the Russian identity, in the identity of most every major writer as well, since they were generally from the upper classes.
It brings a couple of things to mind. One is, in the Slavophile tradition, you speak about how Russia is sort of between the cracks of the West and the Slavophile tradition somewhere, right? And those are kind of opposite poles that get emphasized, but Russia's somewhere in between the two, lost maybe in between the two. One of the interesting points that you make in several pages is the sort of the peasant sense of fairness, right, and of what it means to belong to a community. And Sabornost is the sort of romanticized version of that. The Sabor is a kind of community of ideally loving people who are interdependent and looking out for one another. And this is idealized by Slavophile thinkers as a kind of ideal liturgical community in the world. But the other side of that is maybe this kind of violent fairness. You have that joke about sort of what one peasant has a cow too many, and it's not, they complain not about that person having another cow. It's just that they don't want a cow. They just want the other person not to have a cow is the point, right? And so there's this sense of you cannot rise above the collective. And that ends up being one of the barriers to free market, but also one of the, I guess, justifications of violence against people who tear out of it. Does that seem fair?
Very much so. I think the models you present, Sabornost, or then they had all the various attempts at village administrations, Imsto, and all that. They are all fundamentally static. They presume no change. Change is just not something that's idealized. You keep things the same, and that's where this anecdote about downward leveling comes from. Let's keep it the same. If you get one cow more than me, you're trying to rise above me. Let's keep all within the same pattern. And in one idealized form, it may be attractive, but it was also something the church taught. There was absolutely no movement within the church. He didn't change the calendar. The biggest rebellions against Nikon were when he tried to get people to make the sign of the cross in a different way. You do not change what has been given. And in this sense, the Ossorgins represented a very patriarchal point of view. There's God, the Tsar, us, and peasants, and and this is perfect, and it's the way it should always remain. And when it functions perfectly, it will be good. In their case, they presented the best model of it. Because they were good, they were fair, they felt they had this obligation to be just and Christian and all the other attributes they had. But of course, it also contributed to a lack of political participation, to an acceptance of the status quo. I mean, we'll get, I presume, more to what would happen afterwards, but it eventually led to an inability to accept any of the basic democratic principles that I think we in the West believe are critical for the development of a state. It was a very static mentality, and I think the Ossorgins represented both the beauty of it, maybe the idealized beauty of it, but also the dangers and the fatality of it.
Right. So, for example, along these lines, you write very fairly about how, on the one hand, when the Ossorgins left their estate, the peasants wept. That is, after the sort of appropriation of all of their belongings and after being kicked out of their manor, they had to then leave. And you speak about that being a sad event for the villagers, right, who stayed behind because of the care that they had seen through the Ossorgin family. So on the one hand, there's that, like you said, beautiful aspect of it. And on the other hand, this looks sort of like the height of colonialism, right? Where the oppressed peasant becomes the instrument of their own oppression, thereby loving their oppressor, right? So you are right to point out that both of these forces were kind of conflicting and present. And how do you view this ambiguous relationship between the gentle baron and loving peasant, looking back on it now?
Well, I think there were both, frankly. There were peasants who sort of accepted the kind of the good baden, the good landlord, and the kind of patriarchal model, and may have prospered in it. And at any rate, they knew these people. I mean, the Ossorgins were godparents to many of the village kids. It was considered an honor to get the baden to be the godparent. They were very involved in the school. They were very
education, literacy, yeah,
literacy. You know, they had been good. In the definition of goodness within that context, but there's also a lot of signs. One of I write the story of one kid who was sort of favored by the Ossorgin, who'd been an altar boy and whatnot, who'd discuss things with one of the daughters about art, who turns out to be a KGB agent, comes back and
Misha. Yeah.
Yeah. There's also the police report I found that talked after an estate across the river was trashed, Parashovka, by peasants. There were troubles at the Ossorgin estate. So there was definitely stirrings, as we know, most of them really broke out into the open when peasants began, as soldiers began returning from World War I, and would no longer buy into the system. So, I mean, I could see the same people sort of shedding a tear because this family they had accepted as being good and nice, but not shedding a tear for their exit. It was a personal farewell, and they took care of them. I gather they continued bringing food to them in Moscow for a while.
Right.
I can see the two as being compatible, but at the same time, accepting that this land was now theirs. I mean, that has always been the difference between serfdom and slavery. Russian serfs, who were no longer serfs by then, of course, always considered the land to be theirs. Never really, they weren't just there as property of somebody working on the land. They believed that land to be theirs. And so I don't see a contradiction necessarily between a human leave taking and a sense that bye-bye, it's mine now.
Right. That makes sense that those tears would be complex or ambiguous as everything else in this context, really. And speaking of sort of goodness relative to the context, I was, granted, I'm not responsible for any of this specific behavior, but still feel the characters very personally. And I was especially proud of the part you cite where a Jewish elder from the Tula community, where an Ossorgin served as governor during the violent and tumultuous transition to communism. He lauds Ossorgin as a man of principle, a man of his word, And as long as Ossorgin was in charge, he and his community felt safe. And this is exceptional at the time because, as you're right to point out in the book, anti-Semitism was rampant in Russia. So this is a kind of example of why Ossorgin didn't fit with the transitional politics that were in play and the practices associated with them. He was, in a sense, a poor fit for the job of governor because he was utterly, especially when the Bolsheviks take command, because he was utterly nonviolent. And it pained him even to see what some might describe as deserved punishments. Anytime he saw physical suffering, his stomach turned. So it's odd that he was put in this position because his humanity ended up being a kind of almost a weakness viewed from a certain perspective, but it was also the exact thing needed at the time, right? Was to sort of treat people as people, transcending religious and political outlooks.
Indeed, he was really a wonderful human being. You probably know the rest of his life. They stayed in the Soviet Union as long as one of their sons, Georgy, was arrested and ended up in the Gulag, and they stayed until he was actually executed. He came to Paris, and there he was already in the 70s. He was ordained a priest and was really beloved. I mean, my mother always, and my father too, my father, a priest, remembers him well. I mean, he was, I think, a spiritually exceptional person. So I don't know how much he represents the governor class, but many governors were, in fact, not professional bureaucrats, but landowners, other people who were compelled to enter the service, as they call it, sluzhba, because you could no longer live off the land. That was not a product of socialism, but it was just, once the railroad had made grain, southern grain, cheaper and more accessible, the northern estates were just dying out. So many people, Ossorgin among them, were compelled to enter the service. And I think many of the governors were these non-professionals who brought their personal, non-political skills and principles to the job. They weren't always positive, but in Ossorgin's case, as a deeply spiritual man, and a man almost physically, constitutionally opposed to capital punishment. The night before an execution, which had been ordered in the province in which he was then a deputy governor, he couldn't sleep and had these horrendous nightmares, almost reliving the execution of these people. So he was a deeply fair man. His memoirs, it's an enormous book, maybe 1,000 pages. They finally published it in Russia. I read it in a manuscript I found in Moscow Library, but in his book, he never speaks negatively of any people. There is this very kind of genuinely humane and Christian view of all people. And, in Kharkov, that certainly paid off because there were horrible tensions there between Jews and Poles and between Jews and Russians. And he gained the reputation of being very fair to both. And I think, but, again, I think very honestly, that says less about Russia than about him. Maybe what it does say about Russia is that men like him were put in these positions of being viceroys.
Right, and doctors, for that matter, too. Right. I mean, you write about how he was sort of, because they had the space for it and the material means to provide some kind of medical treatment, he ended up being a doctor, right? Not necessarily at all because he was trained for it, but because he cared for them, and to his mind, the biggest sort of treatment was caring to them as people. Was consoling them and treating them as people, right? But you write about the sort of horrors of the surgery that they had to sort of do on the spot with basically hacksaws, and it was gruesome. And yet, this is kind of all that there was to do, right? So I see that these, I guess, governors were much more was expected of them than
But
just
you're
politics.
probably better hands with the governor than with the local doctor who
Right, right, yes.
was also veterinarian and everything else. Yeah.
Right, all right. So I suppose I would like to look a little bit at just kind of, since you wrote this book published the book in 1999, right? Wrote it, I believe, in 94 or 95 started, is that right?
Yeah.
It's, and so much has happened since then, especially, Putin's rise to power, the invasion of Ukraine. What to your mind has changed from the time of your book's publication to now in Russia, and what to your mind stayed the same?
Yeah. In the book, at the time I was writing it, we thought about that a lot. We came back to Russia already after Gorbachev had finished and everything was changing. We had been away. We were in Russia before Gorbachev for 5 years and basically after Gorbachev for 5 years. So afterwards, it was the era of Yeltsin, and basically the book was written, already when Yeltsin was in power. And I think already then we were beginning to sense that the old forces were coming back. There was a kind of return to the fundamental Russian suspiciousness of politics, of democracy, of people who claim that they're the right people for a job. And among the things that I found was the way they were looking at communism. They were sort of already treating it as something that was alien, something for which they didn't have to repent, something that was not something, it was not something that they had inflicted on their people. And that always sort of worried me. Unless you search in yourself, what is it in your culture, in your history, in your religion that created this horrible nightmare that, preached utopia and sent millions to death, you will not figure out how to go forward. And there was never really an examination. And I think the whole notion of democracy sort of fell apart quite quickly, because in Russia, the word vlast, power, authority, is indivisible. So when they tried to have, the first thing is happening is Yeltsin is shooting at his parliament and the West is supporting him, because they couldn't divide power. Power sharing is a concept that wouldn't work. And I also felt already then, and wrote about it, it's in his book as well, that all the kind of little centers of power, villages, cities, provinces, were all turning into little dictatorships. And so when Putin finally comes to power in 2000 and starts reining them all in, starts sending out appointed governors instead of elected governors, people applaud. These are a bunch of little crooked dictators. And now the good czar is sending out good governors. And so, you sensed that it was falling back into this model of centralized authority, which inevitably leads to dictatorship. I think you can't have, sort of a prolonged period of one-man rule without corruption. And I felt also very strongly, this is not in a book, but in the years after we came back and since, a kind of inability to accept ownership of the government. I mean, I remember calling a young woman in Moscow who we'd met and asking her on an election day, how's the election day going? And she says, oh, that's right, today is an election day. It was, who cares? And so little by little, it reverted. The Duma reverted to corrupt yes men. You had a price list that you could actually get a price list. Some newspaper published it for how much it would cost to have them put a bill that would favor you. And it all fell back to this kind of centralized rule. But now, as somebody noted, without the tempering force of the Communist Party. The Communist Party had internal discipline. It had means of addressing problems. There were places to complain. So you sort of recreated the communist state, but now without any kind of appeal, without any area of appeal. So I think
Any resistance.
fairly early it was headed back towards the model we see today with all of its flaws, enormous flaws.
That you write about how the irony of the communist movement being meant to empower the 86% of the country that were peasants, and it's sort of turning into its opposite, especially politically over the years, where the working people ended up seeing less and less agency in their personal lives when it came to policies or economic improvements. It was kind of a matter of chance whether the gas pipe would make its way to your village, or it would stop halfway and pick up God knows when, right? So one of the other things that you mentioned sort of right after, towards the end of the era that you write about, just before the turn of the century, was how churches were being rebuilt. And I'm wondering kind of, there was, I remember that early 2000 sense of like, well, okay, Russia's restoring its kind of cultural history, and maybe that could be good, right? But as as Kirill's sort of non-condemnation of Putin's invasion of Ukraine reveals, it turned into something that became obviously a kowtows to state power, at least, right? If it's not a total instrument of state power. That sense of maybe rebuilding the church and reconnecting to its roots, has that vanished for you in modern day Russia?
I'm afraid so. I mean, the given, the kind of thread through Russian history among that vast majority of peasants and workers was they were controlled by force and religion. These were two things. You had either authority, vlast, which kept them in line, and you had religion, which was their respite. But the religion always went hand in hand. From the time of Peter the Great, the church was thoroughly under the thumb of the state. And when the Soviets came to power, they didn't pretend to give power to the peasants. They spoke in the name of the peasants. They were the vanguard of peasants. And again, soon, almost immediately, well, totally immediately, recreated the power, and in communism, a religion. I mean, communism in the time we were in the Soviet Union in the 80s was very much a religion. It had rituals, it had kind of its own shows, its own 10 commandments, the 10 ethical whatever underpinnings of the state. And so then you get back again, and the church, again, in the beginning with Patriarch Alexei, who was a wonderful man, there was hope that and there were many, many excellent priests who went to the church. But very soon, it started sort of falling back in line. Rich kind of oligarchs began financing and building churches, and more the church hierarchy became kind of identified with the state. And now you have the Patriarch Kirill totally working hand in hand with Putin. I always wondered why. I knew Patriarch Kirill. I knew him even as a young man. I had met him. So I don't know if it was inevitable or whether, he was gradually corrupted or whether he came to believe this. I don't know the process. I don't
Mhm.
know, again, what is Putin's intellectual process? Some say he was always a KGB agent waiting to recreate the system. I see it more as the two of them being sucked into this vacuum of absolute power.
Mhm.
And that being the easiest way to rule in Russia. Again, I don't think Patriarch Kirill had to sing the praises of this invasion in the totally absurd and horrible and unchristian terms he does. He seems to go beyond what he needs to do. So that does worry me, of course. I mean, I do know that there are excellent priests still operating, but they all do their best to stay under the radar, because otherwise they will promptly be defrocked, as one priest recently was. So, yes, we fell back into the old kind of
Power vacuum.
in power structure, being
Mhm.
sucked into the vacuum of absolute power. Yeah, that's
Right. It's no wonder why term limits exist, right? For exactly this reason, I suppose. Well, yes, I wanted to point out that your mention of lust as authority and power is also a translation of rule. This is what you point out too in the book, right? So the idea of rule doesn't pertain to reason or measure. It pertains to power. And sort of to disentangle that from the Russian mind, especially the post-Soviet Russian mind, has proved awfully difficult. It seems to be something that's stuck, is that entanglement. Um, Regarding Putin's power, I recently read an article from The Hill that was speculating his connection to the bombing of Israel, especially to deter the U.S. from aiding Ukraine as the Russian army continues to falter. Uh, do you have a sense for this kind of connection between how do you view the Israel-Gaza crisis in connection to Russia?
well. I think from Putin's view, it's quite simple. He senses that part of the sort of right wing in America is beginning to oppose aid to Ukraine, and the same kind of sentiment is growing in Europe, and he senses that he would like to sort of separate this from Israel, just as Biden is trying to unite continued aid for Ukraine with aid for Israel. So I think Putin's view is that he can kind of use this um, to his advantage, to kind of slow down what the aid that is flowing in Ukraine. But that's about as far as I think it goes. I haven't seen him
Yeah.
too intimately involved otherwise.
In, or with Hamas in
With
particular,
Hamas,
right?
with the
That's
whole
yeah,
Israeli
right,
crisis. Yeah, sorry.
right. Well, I suppose that I should mention at any point while we're having this conversation, you're welcome to, the audience is welcome to put questions in the Q&A and we'll address them as we can. Um, and I do have a question about the sort of process of you writing the book and the ramifications of writing it on a personal level. Reading your book is also, it takes us to, as far as my branch of the family is concerned, to Paris, and it is awfully tempting to sort of pick up that thread where you had left it off, for the Mihail Ossorgin the fourth, which is what we'd call him, Mikhail Mihalich the third. We have different numbering systems, which is tragic for reading your novel, but nonetheless, I made it through. But how I have a couple of questions about that. How truthful can we be about family history did you run up against that question? Do you have advice to people wanting to tell their family stories? I mentioned that it's a must read for anyone who wants to reconnect to their roots. How do you do that? I mean, what are the pitfalls and the pains and the rewards? Did it create tension within your, surrounding, let's say not necessarily nuclear, but your surrounding family? Um, do you have advice for aspiring writers who want to reconnect to their roots?
Well, one problem with writing about Ossorgins, as you point out, is that you're all called Michael. And many
really
readers
difficult.
complained about that, and I always wondered what I should have done. I should have given nicknames to
Right.
some of them. I mean, my grandfather escaped being called Michael because he was a second son, so the name had
Yeah,
already
but
been
he got
used.
Serge, which is
Yeah,
also not uncommon in our
no,
family.
that also.
Neither is Georgi.
But I think, I mean, this is a very personal view. I think everybody at about the age of 40 or something begins looking backward into roots. Roots is a very strong compulsion to figure out, who am I? Where do I come from? Who preceded me? I've seen a lot of people go through the process. And for me, the process was maybe encouraged by the fact that the Soviets, when we first arrived in 1980, just categorically banned us from going to Sergeyevsk. And so it just became, I got to do this because they're saying I can't. They actually, I write in the book, they sent a team of KGB people to look and finally decided I shouldn't go there because it was such a wreck. I did not feel any tension in the family. In fact, a lot of support for photographs. I mean, a lot of people in Paris and in New York, a lot of relatives had troves of photographs, memoirs, letters, especially Father Michael Ossorgin Rotule in Paris, whose father was Georgi Ossorgin, who was executed. He had incredible letters. So it was just a process, an incredible process. But I think the most exciting part was just it was at the time Russia was opening up. And my goal was never really to write a family chronicle, but to use the family and the village, because I can, only the first part of the book is about the family. The rest is about the village in war,
Right.
Soviet times, and afterwards is to try to take a look, sort of a personal and intimate look at the process of Russian history over a critical 200 years. And I think that's maybe my solution to writing memoirs, because personal memoirs are, fascinating to the family and great vignettes. But I think the goal should also be a bit broader, to look at the context from which you came and how that, how the world has changed, to find some theme that goes beyond. As I say, mine was fired by just discovering something. It was a joint voyage. People in the village also had never seen a foreigner. It still seemed for them enormously dangerous to speak to a foreign correspondent.
Right.
So it was a joint voyage of discovery. Here's what it's like, and in the end, they sort of closed their doors to me, and I sort of moved back to being an American. We sort of jointly plunged into our shared heritage and found where we parted ways. No, it was just
That makes
a remarkable voyage.
it's incredibly illustrative. Personally, obviously, I'm biased, but also it takes you through the process of, well, okay, what did it mean that all of a sudden there was no such thing as private property, and how did that pan out in the lives of these individuals? And one day life is normal in Sergeyevskaya, and things are operating as they always had been, and the next day, within 3 days, all of your belongings are taken away, and you're uh, allowed to keep some of your clothes, but it's no longer yours. Imagine that kind of sense of invasion that we would have now if that took place to us, and yet that's exactly what happened. and have illustrating the histories through the personal family, I think works beautifully. I wanted to, let's see, turn our attention to a couple of questions that have popped up in our Q&A. Let's see, Daniel Gunter asks, on the matter of the entanglement of the empire and the church in the Christian East, Orthodoxy, do you see a thread that goes back to Constantine? It seems to me that there is a certain theological inevitability of the Orthodox Church being unable to disentangle, or at least being inevitably susceptible to using the power of the state. Even in the West, I write the question as an OCA priest, he mentions.
I should note that a very interesting little book has just come out by my father. It was a series of talks he gave on Radio Liberty way back when in the 70s about the foundations of Russian culture, Основы русской культуры. And he talks about that quite a bit, which, that the orthodoxy that came to Russia was, in a sense, alien, while in the Byzantine Empire, it had been organic. It, was part of the Greek world. And so the orthodoxy they practiced was something that sort of extended very broadly and continued. While in Russia, it came from without and was something that was transplanted and perhaps in the outset not fully understood, but therefore took on its own kind of forms. So, I mean, I am not really versed in these matters, but allow me to highly recommend this book called Foundations of Russian Culture. It was put out in Jordanville by the Holy Trinity printing publishing house, and we just had a presentation here in Washington, and a very interesting discussion, because again it picks up on some of these themes where how Russian culture sort of figures in Russian identity, consciousness, and fate.
It makes sense that sort of bringing it in as an instrument of the state, rather than having it develop organically, would in a way predispose it for its state usage, or I guess exploitation is the word that I'm looking for.
Well, like so much in Russia, it's top down. Prince Vladimir says, "All of you into the river, you're now baptized." There's no record of him asking people, but I guess in those days he didn't. But maybe I'm being facetious here, but there is something
no dialogue
that is a thread in our history.
Paul asks, how do you respond to critics in Russia who insist that Western liberal values, democracy, independent judiciary, toleration of various moral values, are alien and therefore are inapplicable to Russian society and Orthodox values?
That was Pobedonostsev, the sort of, he was in the Holy Synod, in charge of the Holy Synod under Alexander III. He was tutored to Nicholas II, and he saw that. One of his quotes I have in the book is that Western kind of sentiments, the notion of a constitution, is the tool of every lie, the source of every sort of intrigue. The notion, because in Russian, you have svoboda and you have voljnost, and voljnost is willfulness. And I think very often they come to see what we see as elemental freedom, but they see it as willfulness. You're using your freedom to celebrate trans and whatever. They see it as a negative force, and that came out in the beginning in the after the fall of communism in the 90s. It was kind of everybody moved to be democraty. But the original wave of democracy proved very incompetent as managers, and very soon they began, you see the reference change in the Russian press and Russian conversation to so-called Democrats. And for them, true democracy is sort of a rational, somebody else rationally interpreting the will of the people and the freedom of the people. And so Western institutions, really in a large part of the Russian population are looked down upon as being an exercise in just laissez-faire, do whatever you want to do, as chaos. And that is, of course, supported by the church, that values, all the Christian values are being trampled upon. And I mean, we have a big streak of that here too.
Great. Well, Harry Pappas asks, I recall learning that Father Thomas Hopko would say that after the fall of communism, if the Russian church does not catechize people and just baptize them indiscriminately, in one generation, the church will be in a very dangerous place. Do you agree? Would vigorous catechism have been sufficient given Russian history and culture?
I don't know if it would have been sufficient, because the original books that came out were all the most elemental kind of guides to how you should properly cross yourself. The things people were asking, well, if I baptized my baby and one of the hands remained dry, is that a valid baptism? I mean, it was all about form, and so many of the early books were about form. Now, about kind of little irrelevant details. I mean, I remember, to my total horror, one priest discussing that you shouldn't go to the bathroom for X number of hours after having communion. I mean, it really reached to that level of an almost infantile detail. But there were priests, and there were priests who began doing excellent work. And many of Father Tom's books were translated, my father's, and they began to spread. It created a certain group. But I think the kind of notion of religion as an almost superstitious bulwark gains strength. I mean, the actual number of Russians who go to church dropped off very quickly and very radically, down now to European levels. So baptism, marriage in church, and going to church and put a candle up if somebody dies, and it's really come down to a kind of a very superficial practice. So I think Father Tom was right in that sense, that this rush to baptism was not really a conversion. In Russian, they actually use two different terms. On krishchonny, baptized, tsерковленный, churched, refers to people who actually embrace a church life. And I think they are in a distinct minority.
I love the oligarch rebuilt glitzy churches are empty. That's another way of putting it, right? I mean, now, you also mentioned how there was a kind of, well, in the absence of any class or institution, for that matter, that ensued following the Bolshevik Revolution, there was nothing to sort of hold down change, right? That this violent erasure of everything it caused things to change so rapidly and to have to reinvent itself so anew that even the people who were committed to the church, let's say, would have had to, I don't know, start from scratch in a sense. So there are people who went underground, but the conditions were such that it was awfully difficult to go underground and to maintain a sense of church. But you're also very careful to say, look, I don't know what I would have done in that position if my life was a threat.
Yeah, I think, these kind of questions are very difficult in general. The notion of dissidence, martyrdom. There were very few active dissidents in the way we came to know that term, as people who publicly rose up against the government and defied it. Very few. I think I mean, it was almost seemed futile. You would immediately be thrown out, or repressed, suppressed, even killed. So active, but kind of searching, finding your own red lines, finding your own kind of moral compass remained very critical in the Soviet era. And, I'd love to see a good book written about that, and the search for your personal parameters with which you could continue to maintain self-respect. And I think the state, the KGB, were very sophisticated in knowing how to guide you to being docile, but still allowing you your sense of decency. I mean, you can't write off all the Soviet people because they weren't dissidents, obviously. And I seriously don't think I would have been a dissident. I know, my translators in the office, we were required to have them. I know that they worked for the KGB because that's the only way you could get translators. Both, well, one has passed away, but they've remained good friends. Because I know that deep inside, they were good people who were basically on my side, trying to get the truth out. So these questions of the moral compass are one of the really difficult questions that I always ponder. And to me, Patriarch Alexei was a prime example. He was the patriarch when the Soviet Union collapsed. He had come from a family of Baltic nobles, and it was actually born outside of communism. He had already been going to church and was a young man. And he really wrestled with these ideas because he had to cooperate and even collaborate with the KGB and the government. But he felt that he could use that collaboration to help preserve the church. He thought the church cannot go underground. He was enormously grateful for all the old ladies who continued to go to church, the babushki, to preserve it. He said it had to remain visible. It had to remain above ground, even in a compromised form, to survive. So, even that was part of a debate. And there were churches that remained open. And when the time came, they could multiply and continue, sort of, again, become real churches. But what the Soviets did kill was any intellectual content. You could not enter a theological seminary unless you came from some little village and were posed no intellectual threat. So most remains.
You point to the. Oh, sorry. You point to the sort of indiscriminate anti-religious stance of Bolshevism. Right? It didn't matter which one it was, just that it was religion was enough to persecute it, right? Well, it takes us back a little bit to Paul's question, but I know, I mean, your father, Alexander Schmemann, Meyendorff, Father John Meyendorff, my grandfather was a priest. They all studied at St. Serge's at around the same time, and they all had profound effects on, well, in their own ways, on Orthodoxy in America, and embraced America, and didn't see sort of the Western value and freedoms presented by America. After all, they fled to Paris, which was where they were allowed to maintain their tradition, right? Not in anywhere in Russia, but in Paris, and then to America ultimately. And you write about how your father was very much interested in embracing American culture. Is that something that you grew up with?
Oh, very much so. I mean, the forms of Orthodoxy we grew up in, of course, were Russian Orthodoxy, but we certainly did not grow up with Orthodoxy as being part of being Russian. It was, the notion was, well, the history was that the revolution had sort of liberated the church, and it was partly through the Sobor of 1917, the church council, which had met and actually, elected this wonderful patriarch Tikhon, who had been archbishop in America. The church had been liberated from the state. the church had become an independent. And the theologians who came to Paris, to Saint Serge, to the academy, were all people who felt that orthodoxy was not kind of an ethnic practice. It wasn't just something practiced by Russians, but that it had a universal message, that it was equally valid anywhere and more valid. And so when my father and Father John Meindorf came to America, this was their goal, to sort of establish an American Orthodox Church with everything in English, get rid of the old calendar and accept that its truths were just as valid and here as they were in any Orthodox land.
In a way that it corrects for that problem of state power of its own. By virtue of being in France, the Russian church has no political sway, right? By virtue of being America, they're not entangled in state power in the same way that they are inevitably entangled in Russia, right? So that is a kind of interesting way for it to be a fuller version of itself, one that can critique the state. Pope John Francis said that's one of the roles of a church, is to sort of stand outside of the state so that it can tell it when it's going wrong, and sort of be an image that it can aspire to rather than collude with it entirely.
Yeah.
Right.
Curiously, that's in the Russian Constitution, which sort of separated church and state.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, unless you had closing thoughts, Serge. Closing remarks.
Yeah. I don't know if I would have written it differently, but the book, I think a lot of it, though, is still to me a sort of a source of sadness, because today, especially, it has, with the invasion of Ukraine, it's become much more difficult to be proud of being a Russian, to be proud of Russian culture. I still take heart from the fact that Russian culture at its best, the writers were always in some degree of opposition to the state, always formed perhaps the only opposition to the state in that culture, and therefore that there is still that element. I see many Russians, but so many have fled abroad, so you sort of despair of there being a major change. And, I think you can only feel profound shame about what is going on in the name of Russia and Ukraine. So, the thoughts of an immigrant these days, and again, I'm third generation outside Russia, so I'm by no means an immigrant, but it's become very difficult to function in that. But I think many of the processes I described in the book hold firm. There is still this vast population of people who totally rely on the state, totally believe in the state, and totally want to be left alone, and therefore do not take an interest in the war unless it reaches to them through a dead son. And that part continues, which makes me wonder for the future. A lot of talk that if Putin goes, things will go better. I doubt it. Something very fundamental has to change in Russian kind of self-awareness. And now that there's been this massive brain drain, I wonder, just as one last thought, I always remember the words. I was in Kiev a few years ago, and we had breakfast with Russian journalists. This was organized by them. And one of them said, we came to Kiev to build in Ukraine what we had failed to build in Russia. And, I do hope that this will prove true, and that, someday Ukraine may, coming from the same roots, same spiritual, ethnic roots, will be able to build the kind of future we had hoped for in the 90s in Russia. And of course, I always hope that Russia will return to its own kind of destiny, to a proper destiny.
A guarded hope, I'm sure. Yes, thank you so much. Serge, such a pleasure to have you here with us and to have this conversation. I hope it's the first of many. I want to encourage you to read the book, which, as you said, it withstands the test of time. It's an incredible look at the history of Russia, the recent history of Russia, that is pre-revolutionary, post-revolutionary, and up into modern day. So if you want historical context for the events, this is perfectly relevant. And there are so many fascinating, painful, sort of, I don't know, shocking tales and personal accounts that we haven't been able to discuss, which are lying in wait for you in the book. So I'm grateful to you, Serge, to our attendees who contributed questions to our discussion, and to those of you who listened in. The Orthodox Christian Studies Center co-directors George Demokopoulos and Aristotle Papanikolaou for the platform. Associate Director Nathaniel Wood, who is also managing editor of the Study Center's publication of scholarly research called Public Orthodoxy. And special thanks to collaborators Siobhan Virlesa, Catherine Mandelakis for helping to organize and promote the event. Thank you for joining our conversation, and stay tuned for Russia Question events in the spring. Thank you, Serge.
And thank you very much, Michael. It was a great pleasure to
My
meet
pleasure.
you, and I look forward to more.